Sayit Ake. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here with you all on this afternoon and cold Saturday. And thank you for the kind welcome and introduction, called Marita. And so today, going to be talking, as was mentioned, and there's a title up here, Pueblo Revolts. I want to highlight the S on the end of revolt because we'll get into that a little bit more. I'm going to be much more far range in my talk today than just talking about the famous Pueblo Revolt of 1680. I want to talk a little bit about that too, but that's not actually going to be my primary focus. It's going to be on the much wider ideas with that S in there. It's very, very important. So go ahead and change the slide. All right, thanks. So just for a quick overview there. So my thesis on here is kind of to talk back about the Pueblo Revolt as being sort of overshadowing and overwhelming all the other stories that are critical that go not just from that time period and the pre-revolt period, but all the way up to this modern day right now and going into the future as well, right? And so in addition, that it's very, very important as well to kind of broaden out the discussion on the Pueblo Revolts because when we just focus on just the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 as the revolt that happened, right? We're basically also continuing what is known as the Black Legend, which is basically something that came out of Protestant England, right, from the time of the Reformation, Wars of Reformation, which was to basically blacklist Spain as this evil empire, create a lot of stories, some of which were fair, some of which were just straight propaganda, right? And it's also a big part of the story of the United States, right? The United States being the city on the hill, a Protestant paradise, right? No Catholics need apply, right? The evil Spanish to the south have it coming. There's a reason, manifest destiny, why the United States must conquer and take all this land as part of the plan of the city on the hill, right? And so when we just focus on the one story, this one story kind of gets highlighted because in the U.S. narratives of the past, it is behooves the United States to highlight the Spanish as particularly evil colonialists, right? Because it makes the United States look good. It perpetuates the Black legend. It perpetuates a story that was started in the 1500s or even earlier, right? Comes from the Reconquista times, right? So, and it's also then ultimately not serving the purpose of the central peoples of this story, right? Pueblo peoples, right? It's feeding into a narrative about the United States and not about our stories of who we are and how we continue to perpetuate ourselves as Pueblo nations here in New Mexico and what is today the Southwest, whatever that is. So this is kind of the over listing of topics I'm going to hit on today. Go ahead and change the slide. So first off, I'm going to assume that most of you are from the area and are familiar with what this word Pueblo is, but it's always good to have a little bit of a preview for those that might not be familiar. Pueblo, of course, is a Spanish word, can mean village, it could also mean nation, and so in many ways that are people, right? And so that's where the use of that word comes from, is from the Spanish time period as the Spanish colonial project was spreading around the so-called New World. The Spanish colonial authorities kind of divided up native peoples, indigenous peoples into two categories, Indios de los Pueblos and Indios Bárbaros, right? So if you were a farmer and lived in a settled village, you became a Pueblo Indian, right? If you did not, you were known as Indios Bárbaros, and I'll let you do the translation on your own from that. And so that kind of created two categories of how the Spanish colonial authorities engaged with indigenous peoples, right? And so it set up a process in there. So in the United States, Pueblos kind of is centered here in the Southwest and is unique to those Pueblo nations here in New Mexico particularly. But if you go into Latin America, Mexico, Guatemala, South America, there are Pueblo peoples everywhere because they are settled farmers and were treated in the same or very similar fashion as how the Spanish operated all over the place, right? So it's just that the United States forgets the rest of the world on a regular basis, right? So here in the so-called Southwest, these are the communities today. Of course, at the time that the Spanish invaded what is today called the Southwest in 1540, there was many, many, many more black dots than you see on this map, right? So that there was perhaps somewhere around 100 Pueblo nations in this area and extending even below this where this map cuts off. And speaking numerous languages. This map kind of highlights the languages that are spoken by the communities that exist today, with about perhaps somewhere ballpark around 100,000 people living in those 100 nations, right? So that is the world that the Spanish invaded in the 1540s, right? And that sort of gives the background for why there's this thing called revolts in the first place, right? And so this is the background on there. It is important to note the diversity that every village is basically like their own country, right? Autonomous, sovereign entity. And of course, then there's a diversity between the villages, even if there's a lot of shared culture. So there's today 3 languages that are related to each other that are spoken by numerous villages. Those that speak Tiwa, Towa, and Tewa. You can see the green up on the top and the bottom, the orange color in the middle, and the one light blue on the side there, Towa, that are related languages, but they're related to each other, like I like to say, they're related to each other like Romanian, Italian, and Portuguese, right? So yeah, they're related, but not mutually intelligible, right? In addition to that, every single village has their own dialect of the same language, so they might understand each other if they speak the same language, but there might be some adjustments to fully understand with ease because of the dialects between every village. Then you have this purple color here. There's 7 villages that speak the Keres language, which is a linguistic language isolate, so not related to any known language in the world, right? So that's as distinctive and different from these other related languages as Mandarin is to English, right? So not really related in any way whatsoever. Then you have this other Zuni language, also a language isolate, also not, linguists don't have a very strong connection with any other language in the world, right? Only spoken by Zuni. And then you have our very culturally related relatives in what is today Arizona and the Hopi villages and the Hopi mesas, which speak Uto-Aztecan language, which is not related to any of these languages over here in any way, right? But is related to a bunch of other languages all the way up near the Canadian border and deep down into Mexico, right? That are lots of linguistic relatives there, right? But there's a shared life way of living in villages dedicated to farming. And being a farmer in the high desert, there's a certain worldview for what makes you successful and able to thrive in that environment, which is carried on to this day. So that's a quick preview to, okay, this is the context, right? So go ahead, change the slide. All right, so the big 1680 revolt is usually highlighted as like there was nothing and then there was a big revolt and it was a big deal, right? But there is quite a few records in the Spanish documents, and so even that the Spanish didn't document, significant number of other revolts, right? And it's important just to think about the word revolt for half a second here, because that word assumes that people were, had already given in to the colonial authorities, and by fighting against those authorities, now you're in revolt, right? That word, you're revolting against the authorities, but that's an assumption that people had actually done that, right? Instead, they might just be like, hey, you can't be messing with us. We're doing our own thing, and then you guys rolled in and started to mess with us, and now we're fighting back. We didn't submit. But this word revolt comes from the Spanish idea of the requerimientos, where the Spanish and their colonial activity were very, very legalistic, right? So they had this whole sheet of paper, right, that were the requirements that whenever they came across an indigenous village, you had to have a notary public with you, you had to have a translator, whether or not they spoke the actual language, optional. You come up to the village, you read this requerimiento 3 times. There's an interpreter translating it into some language, right? You're reading it in Spanish or maybe Latin even. And then there's a notary public there to then sign off on the papers that you read this out loud. And it's saying, and it starts off with like going back to St. Peter as the original founder of the Vatican and the cathedral, the seat of Rome, right? And how that gave the authority to the popes to pass on from St. Peter henceforth and forward, right? As the interlocutor between God and all of humankind, right? And that because of the pope, then they gave the authority to the king, and the king now has the blessing from the pope and the authority as their most Catholic majesties, and that the pope issued a papal bull saying wherever they go and they find stuff, it's theirs, right? And these are the rules of the world, right? And say, guess what? We found you guys. So you belong to us, whether you knew it or not. Those are the rules, right? And so it ends very darkly. And I usually like to read that little last part there because it says, and if you do not submit to us, we will persecute you and enslave you and destroy you, and it will not be our fault. It'll be your fault because you forced us to destroy you because you opposed us, right? And so these were the requirements. And you could just imagine you're living your life in your own community, your own nation, right? And some strangers roll up. They stand in the field at some distance. They start reading some random thing. They're like talking for a long time, right? And then they come out and they're like, do you submit, right? But you don't even know what they're talking about, right? And so that sets up that colonial encounter in a really sort of real way, but it also is the backdrop to even the word revolt. And I couldn't really come up with another good word. There's words that we might use in our language to talk about that there's not I can't think of a good word in Tewa for revolt, but, to end up using this word, I'm like, yeah, just to point out this word has problems, right? So, we're going to just go with it today. Go ahead and change the slide. So, this is just a quick listing of pre-revolt revolts, right? And I always like to start off with, right off the bat, and actually, we go back further in time, there's the Tiwish War, the so-called Tiwish War, when Coronado invaded in the 1540s, and the Spanish are confiscating people's clothes and food and so on and so forth, so people fight back. And so that's a big war. But even once Oñate comes into New Mexico, there's a whole occasion in 1598 where his nephew, Juan de Zaldivar, and a small group of soldiers and other guys go to Acoma Pueblo, assault Acoma Pueblo people, take food, things like that. They get revenge by eliminating those guys. Juan de Zaldivar, Juan was a namesake of Juan de Oñate. His nephew was named after him, right? So he goes in with a vengeance, destroys a place, takes everybody that's still alive, kills hundreds and hundreds of people, takes arrests in servitude, sends others down to Mexico and to live in a convent. And there's the famous and notorious foot chopping sentence, right, that comes from that. But really, if you think about it, that's like a precursor to many, many other times of people asserting their agency and revolting against this Spanish imposition of authority, right? And so right off the bat in Pickery's Pueblo, and I unfortunately my notes are back there, so I'm not gonna be able to say exactly some of my more details from my PowerPoint, but Picaris Pueblo, there's a report in 1621 that their priests had died at their hands. In Jemez 1623, there's a destruction of the mission church there, and of course, the priest also, I believe, dies in that incident. There's a report from Zuni 1632, the priest of God died. And so there's a pattern here, right? In Wadavi 1633, priest dies. Taos 1639, there is a sort of regional sort of revolt being planned, but someone spills the beans on the plan, and so Spanish authorities go and execute the ringleaders. In Jemez sometime, and some of the dates are not totally accurate because these are coming from Spanish documents. These are the Spanish documents of the things that made it into the record, right? So it's not a complete, but just some instances. In some cases, the dates are not actually known exactly. So like sometime between 1644 and 1647, there is a whole slew of pueblos in the Jemez area led by a coalition of Jemez people. And also the record saying that Athabascan-speaking peoples, whether they were Apaches or Navajos, the Spanish were not really clear on that situation at that time, that they were all planning another revolt. Again, someone spills the beans and ringleaders are executed. And sometime in the early 1650s, you have a group of southern Tiwa-speaking pueblos along with Jemez, another pueblo, La Alameda, which is near modern-day Albuquerque, San Felipe, and Cochiti. They were planning another revolt at that time. Again, a similar situation where someone spilled the beans and the ringleaders were caught and kind of crushed down. In the 1670s, the Salinas Pueblos, or late 1660s, the Salinas Pueblos have a plan, a revolt, a very famous individual who was listed by the Spanish as the governor of all of the villages of the Salinas provinces, came up with a plan which would involve chasing the horses, the Spanish horses, into the mountains, and taking, once the horses were chased off, then their enemies were on foot, right, and using that as opportunity. Word gets out. They revolt, the Salinas Pueblos revolt as pretty much as a group, and they had expected that the rest of their neighboring villages would also revolt with them, but it didn't happen. So they revolted all by themselves, and the Spanish came in and attacked and crushed the resistance there. And then again in Zuni 1672, there's a report. This one is sort of amusing because they say Apaches killed the priest. But, you know, Zuni is way out there, so it might be a useful excuse that, yeah, I don't know, he died somehow, but who would know, right? Because he's probably out there all by himself. But maybe it did happen that way. So this is just a very limited listing of some of those events that happened before 1680, the revolts, so-called revolts that happened in that time. Part of the dynamics of that time period also is that you have, and a lot of historians in New Mexico Southwest talk about the church-state conflict that was going on between the head of the Franciscans and the secular government here in Santa Fe, and the conflict between those two groups, which is very colorful. I'm not going to get into that today. But also, it's very important that all along, all of these events also are intertwined with that story, in the sense that often at no point in time were any Pueblo communities giving up the agency that they had, often using the Spanish systems against each other, right? So for example, saying, sorry, governor, we can't go for the repartimiento, the forced labor, annual labor, to help you collect piñon nuts or bison hides or salt or whatever, because we have to help the church, we have to serve the church, right? Or the church saying, sorry, or the governor saying, sorry, church, they can't plaster the church because they have to help me do what I need to do, kind of thing, and playing both sides, right, the whole way. So there's times throughout this time period where the church in New Mexico had supremacy in the colonial government, and other times that the governor sort of had supremacy against the church, and they're being played. Everybody was playing each other, so to speak. But into the 1670s, there's a time period where the church and the secular government kind of aligned together, and sort of in New Mexico. And this run no longer is this kind of dynamic of playing against each other in force anymore. So so there's a couple of serious things that lead up to the Pueblo Revolt. In particular, the demands for tribute, right? So that the Spanish government demanded a fanega, or roughly somewhere around a bushel of grain, corn usually, but sometimes other things were swapped out. A certain number of hides, and there's different depending on what kind of hides, whether they were treated, and so on and so forth, or a manta of cotton cloth. Basically, that's like a square yard of cotton cloth, which in order to weave a manta of square yard of cotton cloth takes a large amount of fields, a large amount of labor of spinning, weaving, all of that. And that was per household. So every household every year supposed to give this tribute, right? So a huge demand of tribute. In addition, there was a repartimiento where you're supposed to, each village was required to work in service to the government for a set number of days, right? And so, and some governors abused that system. Others, it was lots of different variations on that. But then the church also had their service to the church in building these huge mission complexes, right? And then within the first 30 years of the Spanish coming into New Mexico in around 1600, 1598, that they had built 60 of these massive mission complexes, right? 60 of these huge churches, right? With the whole convento on the side, and workshops, and fields, and orchards, and vineyards. And I say they built, but really we built that, because usually it's like one guy, right? Who's like the Spanish guy with a couple soldiers or something like that, right? So that's who builds, is the people in the villages who build these huge complexes and maintain them decade after decade. So all of these demands, in addition, one of the things that the Spanish, the priests found particularly disturbing was traditional practices in the community, right? And so there would be these waves of persecution of traditional practices, right? Destruction of traditional buildings, restriction on traditional dances, and all of these sorts of things like that, right? So that really aligned into the 1670s, where the government and church started to work together in that persecution and demands for things, right? So no longer was these two groups could be played off of each other. And that really leads to the actual famous revolt. Go ahead, change the slide. Go ahead, change it again. And of course, this famous individual who is known, came to light in Spanish documents in particular at that time. But of course, is also one of our statues in the statuary hall made by the famous Jemez Pueblo sculptor Cliff Frawa. So these are one of the two statues that's representing New Mexico in Washington, D.C., right? There was no documents of how he appeared. There's some different kinds of comments made in documents, but nothing, So Cliff, Mr. Frawa used his thinking on this to create the statue as a representation of Pope A. But the general idea is that Pope A was one of a traditional Tewa leader who was actually rounded up in the persecution of religious leaders in the 1670s, was sentenced to execution here in Santa Fe. And when they were getting ready to execute him, and a whole slew of others as well, the Spanish said about 2,000 Tewa fighters went on the hill. I always imagine it's at Fort Marcy, right? Up there, they were on the hill because Santa Fe was like a little dinky place at that time, right? This little, basically just a plaza. And so, yeah, 2,000 fighters up on the mesa saying, if you do that, we're taking you all out, right? And so they're like, oh, actually, we weren't going to execute them. We're just going to flog them into an inch of their life, and then you can have them back, right? And they'll learn a better way, right? And so that's one of the things that occurred to him. At that time, after he was released, the story is that he ran up to Taos, was today Taos Pueblo, and kind of went into hiding at that time, which is when his plan for the 1680 revolt kind of came together. He's always highlighted as the leading figure in this, but there's many other leaders that were involved, right? So there's individuals like Antonio Malacate and a whole list of different individuals, Naranjo family from Santa Clara. They were all very much involved in the revolt, not just one person, but many, many different people. And then many that aren't even recorded in the Spanish documents because they had no clue, right? But the general gist of the plan you can see in the statue's hand is a knotted cord, right? And runners were sent out with these knotted cords to all the villages, and there was many more pueblos than there are today, going to those villages, carrying those knotted cords, and sharing. And some of the thinking also is that the saint days of different villages served as a perfect time for this to occur as well, where many visitors are coming from different villages to visit their neighbors, to share this sort of message that every day they will untie one knot, and on the day that the last knot is untied, that's PR Day, Pueblo Revolt Day, right? The goal was August 12th, which is the Feast of St. Clair, which is interesting to me. But two of the runners coming from Tesuque Pueblo, they had run down to San Marcos Pueblo, and they were cutting across. Individuals from San Marcos Pueblo spilled the beans like, hey, there's these two runners. They're carrying cords. There's this big old plan, right? They capture the runners. They use the usual interrogation methods. They get the information, right? And they're like, that's crazy. They're planning a revolt? I thought they loved us. Like, why would they do that? That's a wild story. They probably just made that up. That's not really happening, right? But news got back to Tesuque that that the runners got captured, that the story was out, like, too late. Now it's too late. The Spanish know about it, but the Spanish were like totally like, no, that's a wild story, right? So they go on with life, and August 10th is the Feast of San Lorenzo. So they're like, well, we're going to go celebrate the Feast of San Lorenzo at Tesuque Pueblo and go on with life because everything is rainbows and unicorns, and our colonial project is working great. And Tesuque fighters go and take the priest out. And all of a sudden, that's what jumpstarts the revolt, right? And so Tesuque is usually noted as the first ones because they did it 2 days before the official untying day, right? So it jumpstarted the revolt. There's a number of villages that join in the day, that day later on, and the following day, and the following day after that, as people may have not got the message right, and they're just untying the knots and going with the regular schedule. Other ones hear the news and are like, oh, we better jump on it too. There is some, I won't say, there's hints that maybe Picary's Pueblo even revolted before August 10th. When they're way up in the mountains, they're like, how would they know if we just take out the church first? But it's not confirmed entirely, just that may have happened, right? And also even there's pueblos that wait until after the designated day before revolting, probably looking to see, oh, is this really going to happen? Did everybody remember a few years in living memory, just a few years before that, there was clear memory that the Salinas villages, they had a major revolt and no one jumped in on it, right? So probably everybody's like, well, is just Tesuque going to revolt on their own? Oh, San Ildefonso jumped in too. Oh, okay, San Cristobal, all these villages starting to revolt, and they're like, I guess we can too. We'll see what, and so it's starting to build out, right? And the Spanish totally caught off guard. And so one of the main things that happens right off the bat is that in most villages, the first thing that happens is destroying the church, burning the church, destroying the bell. In many cases, a bell is shattered into little tiny pieces. And imagine the hard work and effort to destroy one of those large, heavy bells and smashing it into little pieces. And it goes to show part of the story what the revolt was about, because those bells were part of that, the colonial project, the ringing of the bell to call people to mass. And of course, you didn't go to mass, get flogged, all of those sorts of things, right? So the destruction of the bells in all the villages, a very, very important thing. Priests, not very many priests survived. It's in my notes. I want to say it's 21 that died at that time. Almost all the priests in New Mexico at that time. Could be 21, 23. Don't quote me on that. Somewhere around there, a couple dozen-ish. And so also hundreds of those individuals that had estates away from the main sort of, like away from Santa Fe, away from some of the other villages, away from Santa Cruz, places like that, those people who were out on their own often got attacked and their estate got destroyed and stuff. So quite a few of the settlers died, and there wasn't that many at that time, but a huge proportion of them died during the revolt. And at that time, because of the distance between places, the lieutenant governor of New Mexico was stationed south of Albuquerque, in the Belen area, and then the governor ran the north from Santa Fe, right? So the governor at that time was kind of hunkered down in the plaza area, totally besieged, waiting for reinforcements from the south to come up, right? The lieutenant governor was down there with whoever was down there and saying, I think those guys got wiped out. We didn't hear from them at all. You want to go up there? No, we're not going up there, right? And so they're just waiting for each other's, but they don't even know that, there's no text message, no cell phone, right? So these guys are like, they said there was like thousands of Tewa fighters surrounding Santa Fe at that moment. And they cut off the water supply, and no more water. They're getting pretty desperate. They're like, well, we might as well charge out of here and die fighting or whatever. So there's a couple stories on this, right? One is the official Spanish recollection, which is we charged out, we slaughtered countless besiegers, and we fought our way through, and it was through the glory of our king and God, and we got out of there, right? Another version is they came charging out, and the fighters were like, go ahead, go on, get out of here. We don't want you around here anyway, right? Somewhere between those two versions is probably what really happened. Anyway, they book it towards Albuquerque, and they get down there, meet up with the lieutenant governor. They decide they're not going to retake Santa Fe. They take off down to El Paso. They are joined by the remnants of those Salinas villages that had, in this late 1670s, there was a huge famine and disease epidemic that happened there. They had moved over to near modern-day Isleta, Pueblo, and they did not revolt with everybody else. Remember, no one revolted when they revolted. Well, when everyone else revolted, they didn't revolt with them. And so the primary large group left with the Spanish down to what is near modern-day El Paso, New Mexico. And ended up many of those individuals building villages there on the Mexican, what is today the Mexican side, and the U.S. side, Isleta del Sur, and there was villages in basically what is Juarez now, right? And so the Spanish were kicked out of New Mexico proper for about 12 years, right? And so this is where the 1680 revolt is very famous, right? Because there's not too many examples in the United States where indigenous people entirely ejected colonial authorities. I like to point out, though, that in what is today Mexico, there are numerous other conflicts like this. In some cases, indigenous peoples ejected the Spanish for generations, right? For 50, 60 years, right? From mining operations in the Sierra Madres and stuff like that. But we don't know anything about that because we're in the United States. So there's many, many other indigenous revolutions in Mexico that are as successful or even more successful and with very similar kinds of stories, right? And of course, the Spanish do come back They right away they're sending immediately after they're thrown out. They're sending like fact-finding missions into New Mexico, and they're looking for because again they're like, why did this happen? We thought everything was going great. Like, how could this? And this is where a lot of the notes of the historical record come from about Pope A. They didn't. The Spanish didn't really know about this. Well, they knew about arresting him and so on, but they didn't know how this had actually transpired. There's a individual named Juan, the Spanish called a Tewa named Juan, and they capture him doing one of their forays. They torture him. They get a lot of information about what happened, right? And so they start looking for ways that they can come back and get retribution or how they're going to do that. By the 1690s, an individual who is named after the shopping mall down here, or maybe the other way around, de Vargas is set as the governor of New Mexico, even though he was down in El Paso, was designated as the leader of New Mexico, the governor. He's the one that comes back up, and by the time that he's coming back up, he comes up 2 times, right? So the first time he comes up they're getting lots of news down south that the united faction against the Spanish has broken into different groups. Different groups are fighting against each other. Some people are even saying, hey, you guys could come back because these Tewas up here are real pain or whatever, right? So there's a lot of conflict going on, right? And so one of the individuals also that at one point the Spanish come up to Zia Pueblo under earlier governor in the middle of the 1680s. They attack the Zia Pueblo. They kill hundreds of people. They take everybody else they can prisoner and execute almost all the males that they take as prisoner. But one of them that they take back to El Paso with them is an individual known in history as Bartolome de Ojeda. And so he is an important Zia leader of some sort, but can speak Spanish as well. He becomes a key ally of the Spanish because he can speak multiple languages, including Spanish. He apparently seems that he became literate and everything like that, becomes a very large player in this whole story, but it's almost never talked about. Like, it's usually kind of, you hear about de Vargas, but you don't hear about Bartolome de Ojeda, right? So Bartolome de Ojeda and de Vargas come back. He has a translator that can talk for him, and going from village to village, it seems like everybody is like, yeah, we don't want to fight with you. We're not here to fight. We're okay. Like, even some people are like, it's all right if you come back. At least that's what he thinks. And so he goes on a big tour. There's no fighting or nothing like that. That's what the peaceful reconquest is his little tour of New Mexico with Bartolome de Ojeda, where there's no fighting, nothing happens. Everybody seems like they love the Spanish again. Everything's going to be great. Goes back, gets his whole military forces, all the colonists, comes back the following year, and everybody's like, no, we didn't sign up for that. And plus, he finds a bunch of Tewa people living in the plaza. They reconfigured the whole plaza as a Tewa village, right? He was like, oh, we need to move in there. It's getting cold. Winter's here. Like, we need those houses. And they're like, well, we live here now. He's like, remember when you peacefully submitted last year to us? We're like, no, that's not part of the plan, right? So there's a big old battle, violent assault on Santa Fe. Lots of people die, so on and so forth. And Santa Fe is reconquered. He next spends the following year and a half or so attacking different factions, gathering allies, and at every single step of the way, every one of de Vargas's successes is really due to Bartolome de Ojeda. So he's like, oh, he's the guy that led this whole thing. But in many cases, so for example, Cochiti people were in a defensive mesa, right? The Spanish were going to frontal assault the cliff, right? That was like, this is our plan. We'll charge the cliff. Somehow we'll win. Bartolome de Ojeda is like, you know, there's a path. Goes around, follow the path, and then you don't have to charge the cliff. That's what they do, and then that's how they're successful. Again, at Jemez Pueblo, up on the mesa there, the Spanish were like, let's frontal assault the cliff. It'll be great. Ojeda's like, there's a trail around the back. And that's how that happens, right? Every single time, even they attack Black Mesa or Tunjo, as we call it in Tewa, in the northern Rio Grande. Most of the Tewa villages were on top of there. And they attack it, they're repulsed, they have to retreat, they go away, they come back the following year, they attack it again, they're repulsed again, right? And Bartolome de Ojeda's like, hey, it's September, it's harvest season. You don't need to be charging into the cliffs anymore. Send some soldiers out and start cutting the crops down and burning them. They start to do that, and immediately my great ancestor came down with a white flag. Immediately said, hey, we'll go back to our villages. We're not going to fight anymore, right? So again, even that, the one who told them what to do was Bartolome de Ojeda, who is mostly not really highlighted in a lot of ways, right? But was a key part of that story as well. So that's kind of the great fast summary, the Cliff Notes version of the Pueblo Revolt. Left quite a few things out, but there's a big sort of sweep on there. Go ahead, change the slide. So the Spanish are back, now what, right? And so it's really important to highlight that continued agency. Go ahead and change the slide again. And one of the things that you can see these sort of revolts going on is that in Santa Fe, and this was supposed to already have been the case, but they only really got it rolling after the Pueblo Revolt, was the need to have basically an attorney for Indian affairs, right? Known as a protector of the Indios. And this all came from Bartolome de las Casas' groundbreaking sort of recounting of the bad parts of the Spanish colonial project, right? So this started off a process that led to what's called the Laws of the Indies, the new Laws of the Indies, which made indigenous slavery illegal. It set certain standards for engaging with Pueblo Indians, right? And how government would work within those villages. Those sorts of things were kind of set up in that fashion. And so although there was governors that were designated in Pueblos from the pre-revolt time period, in the post-revolt period is when that Office of Protector of the Indios really came into play here in Santa Fe. And although there wasn't always one all the time, there was times there was nobody there. But that Pueblo governors really used that opportunity to make sure and advance the agenda of maintaining our communities as our independent and able to do our own thing. And even using the government of the Spanish government against the Spanish government, right? Saying, you gave us these canes that we carry with the stamp of the king, designating that we are direct vassals of the king, right? We have authority that you cannot mess with our communities or anything like that, right? And going to that office, probably in the palace of the governors, and saying, hey, guess what? There's these individuals who are messing with our way of life. And here's a good example. In 1791, there was a priest at Isleta Pueblo saying, we don't want them to be practicing some of their traditional activities. Came trooping up here, Protector of the Indios, saying, hey, don't forget that we serve the king, right? And he allows us to do what we want to do and protect our community in the way that we want it to be. And so this was kind of like an override card, like a Uno reverse card, right? So you go up there to the Protector of the Indios and be like, sorry, nope, we're not gonna do that. And it's amazing. In the 1700s, this usually ended up being like, no, you can't stop them from having rabbit hunts. You have to allow them to do that. Cut yourself out, priest, right? Go ahead, change this, next slide. Another example, near San Felipe Pueblo, there was some settlers that wanted to take some land in between Santa Ana Pueblo and San Felipe Pueblo in the Narrows, the Angostura. And again, these settlers just kind of moved in and started building houses on land that wasn't theirs. And so right away, go up to the Protector of the Indios and be like, hey, Uno reverse this, done. They're not allowed to be there. And sure enough, they say, hey, the people of San Felipe Pueblo, they're loyal vassals of the king. You guys get out of there, right? And so, in a way, these are just little examples. Yeah, it's not a violent conflict, right? But it's using that agency to say, hey, you're not allowed to do these sorts of things. We're going to maintain our villages, our land base. We're going to fight against these kind of incursions into our livelihood, right? Go ahead, change the next slide. And then I think one of my when I used to have the opportunity to teach Pueblo history, it's one of the things that not very many people in New Mexico know about, much less anywhere else, right? But it's a very, very important event that happened in 1837 after the after the Mexican War of Independence, and this became part of Mexico, is a Chimayo rebellion. So go ahead, change the slide. And it's related to this dude. And he was, there's some little facts in case you're on Jeopardy one day and you need to know some really random stuff about this very colorful individual. Larger than life, very interesting guy. Maybe not very successful at being president, but got to be 10 times, and so it goes to show you. And so at one of those times that he was president, he realized, hey, we have no money because I keep fighting wars and doing ridiculous stuff, and we have no money, so we need to reorganize our area, and they created something called a departmental plan, right? And this was so that they could maybe get some taxes, right? And this is kind of going off a long-standing issue that goes back into the Spanish time period in the 1700s when I'm trying not to go down that rabbit hole too far, but the Bourbon family, a royal family in Europe, and the Habsburgs, another royal family in Europe, were fighting over the crown of Spain, right, in the first decade of the 1700s. And it's because the heir of the king of Spain, Carlos II, passed away with no heir, right? He unfortunately, if you ever see his family tree, it's shaped in a circle because all of his family is enclosed in a nice, tight genetic pool, right? And this resulted in him not being able to procreate. And so because of that, no new king of Spain, so these other guys start to fight over it. They fight, the Bourbons win. They realize, oh, we won the big empire, but there's no money in the bank, right? And so they start to create a bunch of different reforms known as the Bourbon reforms to try to scale back some of the powers of the church in particular, but try to raise some revenues. They're never really totally successful at that. Then Napoleon comes around and there's all this other stuff. Anyway, this guy's kind of picking up on that old, let's reorganize and see if we can raise some taxes business, right? So this passes in 1835. News takes 2 years to get to New Mexico. So in 1837, they're like, you want to do what? Right? Go ahead, change the slide. So when they're trying to implement the plan of department in Chimayo, or Chimayo and Santa Cruz, there is some local officials that say, no, you're not, we don't approve of this plan, this department plan. You're not in charge here, right? They arrest one of those officials. His friends and primos and Pueblo peoples from the neighboring villages go and break him out, right? Then they all gather together at the church at Santa Cruz. There's a picture from a few years later. And they develop this proclamation and announce it. This is the translation in English. And so this representative body gathers together and declares that they're not going to accept any plan of department, right? And I have here highlighted one of the key things because this is sort of a whole extra government that included Pueblo representatives and everything. Say, to defend our country to the shedding of our last drop of blood to obtain the victory sought after, right? So they say, this is our land. We're not going to allow you to reorganize in any way. There's no Uno reverse card anymore because the protector of the Indios went away with the Spanish when they left, right? And no taxes, right? Of course, that's the regular thing to say, nope. And so they basically go into open rebellion. Well, the governor here in Santa Fe gathers all of the soldiers in New Mexico, which is like 100 dudes, maybe. And he calls up the Pueblo auxiliaries. He says, come on, Pueblo auxiliaries, you've always been there for us. Let's go and crush the rebellion in Chimayo. So he gets a bunch of auxiliaries from San Felipe and Santo Domingo Pueblos. They join up. They go marching towards Santa Cruz over here where the rebels are at. They meet near in between modern-day Pewaukee and San Ildefonso Pueblos. That's the road used to go that way. And all of the Pueblo auxiliaries switch sides. They just like walk across and join the other side. And some of the Presidio soldiers too, they're like, that we're going to go with those guys, right? And so the rebel forces include all these Pueblo auxiliaries, all these Pueblos from the north, all the local vecinos, they're all together. They take down those Presidios, defeat them, totally defeat them. The governor takes off running south, fleeing New Mexico. Santo Domingo fighters catch him. There's some different versions to this. Either way, his head separates from his body. Some versions include kickball with the head, but I'm not too sure about that. But either way, governor meets an end, right? And this group, go ahead and change the slide. This group, there's an example of a Presidio from that time. This group select this individual, Jose Maria Gonzalez, as the new governor of New Mexico. This guy is known as a Inisaro. His father was a Plains native, indigenous person from one of the Plains tribes, not known exactly which one. His mom was presumably also from Taos Pueblo, so he was basically half Taos and half indigenous person from the Plains, right? He was married at Taos Pueblo. His wife passed away. He got remarried at Picary's Pueblo. Again, the wife passed away. He got married at Santa Cruz, so he had in-laws everywhere in the north. And he was a very well-known cibolero, which is a buffalo hunter. So this was a very important custom at that time. We'd go out on a seasonal basis and go hunt buffalo, bring the hides back and meat back, right? So he was well known for that. He couldn't read or write. But all of this combined group of New Mexicans said, you know what? We want this guy as our governor. And so this is the one time that New Mexico had an indigenous Pueblo person as a governor of the whole state, right? Very, very short period of time. August 10th. Strangely enough, that's Pueblo Revolt, when the Pueblo Revolt actually started, August 10th, and this is the same day this Taos man becomes governor of New Mexico, right? August 10th. I don't know what's going on in August, but it's an interesting time. And one of his allies, this guy named Manuel Armijo, notorious guy. He's friends at first with the rebels. Very short, within a few days, he switches sides. But he's also friends with the ricos, the American traders and wealthy individuals in Santa Fe. And there's some evidence that he got paid off to basically turncoat, or maybe he just was following the money, right? And before you know it, he's switched sides to be the counter-revolutionary, right? And so he ends up joining the remnant Presidio forces, other soldiers and local militia near Albuquerque, and they declare the Plan de Tome, right? They're saying we have a plan that you're not allowed to pick your own governor. I'm in charge now as a general here, as an officer here, on and so forth. And so they issue that proclamation. Within a few days, Jose Gonzalez hears news of this. He's like, yeah, we're not here in rebellion. We just said, like, we have demands, and we want those demands met, and we're not going to fight about it. He leaves Santa Fe. Armijo comes in with 150 dragoons from Veracruz that had showed up by that time. They take over Santa Fe. They catch some rebels. They execute them. The rebels run up to Truchas, New Mexico, and they're hiding out in the mountains. And then Armijo's like, well, that's it. We're going to put them away, right? So they go again to near Santa Cruz, and they go and fight a battle. Armijo's records say they went in there, they took out all the rebels, captured the leaders, executed them. That's it. That's how he says it went down. In the about 100 years ago, in the early 1900s, there's an individual from anthropologist named John Peabody Harrington, very famous guy. He's interviewing elders at different pueblos about place names, writing an ethnogeography. He asks an elder from Okeowinge, or San Juan Pueblo, as it was called at that time, about a certain place, and that elder tells this whole story about something that happened at Hut'a'ahu, aka Arroyo Seco. He says, at that time, there were Mexicans fighting against us, and we were fighting against them. And a leader, he named who the leader was, It said the leader of our group from Okeawinge was an individual by the name of Baltazar, and that we had gone out and we fought that Armijo guy, and we defeated him, and he had given up, and so he came with a white flag to ask to pick up after the battle, right? And it was a trick, and he had captured everybody after he had been defeated. He threw them into the church at Santa Cruz and locked them up and would only feed them bread and water for a whole slew of days before executing the leaders. So this oral history is radically different than Armijo's version of events. So you have to always be careful about those records, right? That maybe that didn't go down at all like they said. And Armijo was a very shady guy. We'll come back to him in a second. Go ahead, change the slide. So leads to the other time when the Americans invaded in 1847. At that time, one Manuel Armijo was governor of New Mexico, right? And so at that time, the people were preparing to defend New Mexico against the Americans, right? So they had built fortifications and they were getting all ready to go fight against the Americans. And a strange thing happened, right? So Armijo was governor, and all of a sudden, the American traders were like, it'd be kind of cool if the Americans came, right? Because we're Americans, they're Americans. And be nice if that happened, right? But the New Mexicans were like, no, this is not part of the United States. We're not allowing that to happen. So they were all ready to fight against the Americans. And then Armijo's like, actually, you know what? There's not a problem here. Everybody go home. I'm disbanding the militia. Go take your weapons. Everybody go away. Disbanded everybody, sent everybody home, abandoned the fortifications by Glorieta Pass. And then in the middle of the night, he bails on New Mexico. Treasury disappears, everything, like he's like just incognito, runs away, right? So like I said, he's kind of a shady guy. And so the Americans roll into Santa Fe unopposed because he disbanded the militia, right? And the Americans are like, yeah, see, everybody likes us, and welcome, democracy, here we come. And so first thing they do is go find the biggest pine tree they can in the mountains, and they plant it in the center of the plaza with a gigantic American flag. So in 1847, the plaza looked like a car dealership, so just in case you wanted to know. And so that's how that went. And they're like, well, since no one was opposed to us, we'll just go on to the real prize, which is California, because we don't really care about New Mexico, or it's just on the way to California, right? And so he takes off with most of the troops, leaves a small force behind. As soon as he leaves the area, the Pueblos and vecinos together are like, well, let's get back down to business. Remember, we didn't want these guys invading our country. Remember that proclamation from the Chimayo Rebellion, we're ready to defend this to the last drop of our blood. Sure enough, go ahead, change the slide. In January, there is a combined revolt led by Taos leader, Tomas Romero, and then the Hispano leader was an individual by the last name of Montoya. And they plan and they kill the governor of New Mexico, the American-imposed governor of New Mexico, individual by the last name of Bent, because he was living up there. He had a house up there. They attack all the American traders in the area and basically kill all the traders in the area. And they start to come down to Santa Fe. The rebellion also is on the east side of the mountains, so in Mora and those mountain villages on that side, San Miguel de Varo, all those areas, they start to revolt and raid the remnant American forces, right? And so the Americans, again, come up to Santa Cruz de la Cañada, and they meet the rebels there. Who knew there were so many battles by the Dreamcatcher movie theater? But that's what happened. And so there's a big battle. Rebels get defeated. They start to retreat. There's a whole series of battles going back towards Taos that are unsuccessful. However, when the troops go, the Americans go and attack Mora, they're defeated. The people at Mora defeat the Americans, and they have to retreat back to Vegas. They come back with mountain howitzers, and they level Mora. They just destroy the place, kill as many people as possible. They end up coming because Las Vegas is also somewhat in rebellion. They end up destroying most of Las Vegas as well. And then the other force going up towards Taos, the local Hispano and Pueblo peoples are fighting against the Americans, fortify Taos Pueblo, and they're defending that area. They again attack the village unsuccessfully. A lot of the people go into the church, though, as a place of refuge, knowing you're not supposed to attack the church. So Americans light the roof of the church on fire to make a lot of smoke. And then they use artillery to batter the door down. Once the door goes down, then they send grape shot into the nave. All the people sheltering in there, people go running out. As soon as they run out, they send in the cavalry, cut down as many people fleeing into the hills as possible, right? So this is actually, the Mexican government didn't defend us against the Americans. We had to do it ourselves, right? So these are not usually recognized as Pueblo revolts, but at every part of it, Pueblo people were deeply involved in the defense of our homelands and way of life against these different invading or threatening forces, right? So go ahead, change the slide. Now, we're moving into the American time period. One of the first things from the very beginning the Americans are interested in is how much land they can steal from as many people as humanly possible, right? Plan A, let's steal everything that's not nailed down, and even if it is nailed down. Go ahead, change the slide. So, one of the things they said about is like, whose land is whose so that we can steal it, basically. And so this is where there's a whole time period in the 1850s, 60s, onward, where they're looking for land, evidence of land ownership and how you can apply taxes to steal people's land. And, there's all sorts of, that's a whole story as well, right? Now, under the laws of the Indies, each Pueblo village didn't receive a land grant. Instead, the Spanish recognized that they had a Pueblo Square League. So from the Campo Santo of each village, there were a certain number of varas, a measurement of a league in each direction from that Campo Santo, and all the land on that whole area was inviolably that Pueblo's land, right? So they would always be ejecting Spanish settlers trying to go on there, sheep wandering over there, all of that, right? But there was usually never any kind of piece of paper saying that that's what it is, right? So what they would do is they would take and the vara is a cane, the length of a cane, right? So the cane is the same length as a vara, and they would measure it out. They would get pieces of rope with 50 varas in length, and they would stretch it and stretch it and stretch it until they reached the measurement that they needed. Then they would put a big pile of rocks. Be like, that's one side, that's the other side, and so on and so forth, right? It's about 17,200 acres, give or take, right? And so the Americans come in, and they're like, so whose land's who? Because we want to know what we can take, right? And so there's no paperwork, right? But this one dude, or in generally, one dude somewhere in Socorro, out of his backyard, starts coming up with land grants, right? They're known as cruzate grants. They're written in very poor Spanish, lots of poor grammatical mistakes, like as if somebody had copied it, but it's not literate, so it doesn't understand grammar or anything. They're just copying one after another, selling them for like $5 to $10, $20 out the back, which is a lot of money in that time period, right? The paper, though, and they're dated to the late 1600s, right? The cruzate grants are like dated to 1690 or something weird, which is weird because remember, the Spanish were not here, right? So they're like, why are all these grants when they're not even in charge? And like, there's a lot of fishy things. Probably the most dead giveaway is they have a watermark on the paper, and the watermark's from like the 1830s or 40s, something like that. So, and here's where it gets very interesting again. That watermark is only used by certain peoples at that time. And in New Mexico, there's not really that many people using that paper with that watermark, right? But there's one place where they're using that watermark, and that was Manuel Armijo's office. And the connection there was like his adjutant or something like that was involved with the dude in Socorro, and they were like, probably took the paper from the office and they're like, let's copy and make up some stuff and make a quick bucks or whatever. Anyway, the United States is like, that works. And so even at the time, they're like, I think these are forgeries. And they're like, let's go with it. So this sets patents for most of the Pueblo lands at that time. By 1864, when the Lincoln Canes and the patents come together, right? Because they're recognizing these land grants based on fictitious documents, right? Go ahead, change the slide. But this also creates a problem because within the United States, you had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which in that treaty said all people who were in what was Mexico were citizens of Mexico. When the United States annexes this area, they become citizens of the United States if they want. If they don't want to, then they have to leave. But if they do, and almost everybody does, they instantly become citizens of the United States. Any land that they had is recognized as their land, and that's how it's going to work, right? However, Pueblo people under Mexico, we were citizens. We could vote and everything like that. We're citizens of Mexico. And to put that into context, in the United States, it was not the Indian Citizenship Act until 1924. And in Mexico, 100 years before, you're all citizens, right? So way different trajectory than the United States, right? But then the United States had a big problem. They're like, well, Indians are not allowed to be citizens in the United States, and we accidentally let a bunch of Indians be citizens, and now we have a problem, right? So they're trying to figure out that issue. It's a thorny issue. It comes to head in the 1870s in this Supreme Court case where they kind of resolved from the United States perspective this issue to some extent. They said, actually, Pueblo peoples are not Indians because they're only in feature, this is the actual language of this decision, only complexion and few habits, other respects superior to all but a few of the civilized Indian tribes of the country and equal of the most civilized thereof, therefore not Indians, right? And so, but now because they're not Indians, they can dispose of their land, right? So go ahead, change the slide. So between that time and 1913, there was about 3,000 non-Pueblo families that settled on Pueblo lands, and that huge tracts of land were lost during that time period through legitimate sales or otherwise, right? So a huge problem that arose during that time that as a result of that Supreme Court case. Now, by 1913, that's the time the United States is trying to New Mexico is trying to become a state, right? And the United States doesn't really want New Mexico as a state, right, in the first place. And that's why we're one of the last ones to become a state, because they didn't really want us to be a state. And you can read the congressional reasons why. They're very racist and other things, right? But anyway, that's why. So, but by this time they're saying, well, if you're gonna do this, you need to resolve this land issue. So go ahead, change the next slide. And so this gives rise to another Supreme Court case, United States v. Sandoval. The language here is very similar, interesting to contrast with the other one. People of Pueblos, although sedentary, dispose of peace industry, nevertheless Indians, because they're always living separate, isolated communities, adhering to primitive modes of life, influenced by superstition and fetishism, chiefly governed according to crude customs inherited by ancestors, essentially a simple, uninformed, inferior people. Therefore, Indians, right? And so this changed it. That was saying the switch. All the lands have to be protected, and they're not allowed to be disposed. And we can solve this issue so that New Mexico can become a state as part of the package deal, right? And so, however, you already have all this land that have been essentially separated away. So it creates a big issue. Go ahead, change this next slide. And in addition to that, at the same time, you have a lot of anthropologists of that time, missionaries, things of that nature coming around, and in some cases coming and seeing traditional dances at Pueblo communities. And some of these individuals were super horrified at what they saw, right? They're absolutely horrified. And so one of the Protestant missionaries that came started to report on these activities, came up with what's known as a secret dance file in the 20s, recording these activities that eventually led to an Office of Indian Affairs Circular number 1665, which is basically written by missionaries for the purpose of the Office of Indian Affairs to share around, basically finding a way to outlaw traditional activities, not just in Pueblo communities, but in all indigenous communities in the United States. And so where this had the bigger effect actually is not in New Mexico or the Southwest, but in other places. But this came from that time. So this land issue also coincides with this Indian dance controversy, as it's called. Go ahead, change the next slide. And so this combines together where there's this pressure to restrict indigenous cultural activities. And then the senator from New Mexico, last name of Bursum, came up with a bill called an Act to Quiet Title to Lands Within Pueblo Indian Land Grants, basically saying, how can we figure out the land that they lost, how we can make sure it stays lost, right? That's really what it's called. And so this created the sort of impetus for a lot of Pueblo governors to all join together, right, to battle against this bill and also against any kind of persecution from the superintendent, the Office of Indian Affairs, to make sure that these combined threats kind of held at bay. And through a lot of lobbying and work and also allyship with other groups, including this guy right here, John Collier, who's came to Taos one time and fell in love with Indians, and the rest is history. Very important guy in the story of federal Indian policy. But they worked together to defeat the Bursum bill and lead to the Pueblo Lands Claim Commission. Go ahead, change the slide. So the Pueblo Lands Act basically said, well, we can't get all the land back, but we'll try what we can to provide compensation funds for lands that lost, and then you can try to buy it back, right? And so not all cases was this possible, because between 1924 and 1944, Pueblo communities added over 500,000 acres of land, but also a lot of areas remained checkerboarded where people had settled and they were unable to get those lands back. In some cases, those lands were purchased twice. For example, Santa Ana Pueblo purchased a lot of land in the area near Bernalillo, in that area, in the 1700s. The Americans, through the forged the fake land grant paperwork, right, they lost a lot of that, and said people moved on to those lands, so then they had to buy it all over again, right? And so, but this was a process that was created for that, and 1944 say, okay, it's all solved, the Pueblo land problem has been fixed, and we're good, right? But to this day, there's still ongoing challenges of trying to buy back land that was originally ours within the exterior boundaries of our home base, or adding the traditional lands that should have always been part of our lands, right? So go ahead, change the next slide. But part of this was the impetus for what is the All Indian Pueblo Governors Council, a pan-Pueblo group of leadership body, governing body, to battle on behalf of some of these issues, right? So almost going back to the Pueblo Revolt time of all these villages joining together. And so also each in the different villages doing their own work, in some cases being very successful, and after that time period, and returning some lands like the Zuni Salt Lake, and of course Blue Lake for Taos Pueblo as well, right? Go ahead, change the next slide. And like I said, there's still continuing efforts over land, but also think about water. Water is a serious issue, that there's only so much water, right? And more demand for that water, and making sure to protect those sources of water to continue to practice those traditional lifestyles of farming and taking care of the plants, the animals, all of that as well. Go ahead, change the next slide. The last part I want to end on today is schooling, because as was mentioned in my in the introduction, that I'm the executive director of our tribally controlled school at Santa Clara Pueblo. And so I want to kind of look at also how this is ongoing in other ways, more personal to me in my current role, right? So the Pueblo revolts that are going on now in that realm as well, right? So go ahead, change the next slide. When the Americans invaded, and they had the first Indian agent here in Santa Fe, one of the first things that happened is Pueblo governors came to that office and said, we want our lands protected, we want tools, and we want education. They asked for those different things, right? By 1870, there was 2 pueblos that had schools located within their village, Santo Domingo and Santa Clara Pueblo. And over the following years, a whole slew of other villages gained teachers as well in schools. Sometimes they're operating out of someone's house. Sometimes they built like a little schoolhouse within the village, right? And so this was an important ask. This is This is our teacher in school at Santa Clara in 1910, right? So this is where I work, hey, 110, 113, 14 years ago. Go ahead, change the slide. Now, actually, go change the next one. It's different order. Now, the more famous side of this is the Indian industrial schools that got started in the late 1800s. Some of the earliest ones started here in New Mexico. So the most famous first one at Carlisle Indian School, right? But 1879, I believe, is the date for Carlisle. Within a couple years, they were like, that's such a great idea. Let's build one in Albuquerque. Built one there, 1881. 1890, Santa Fe Indian School. 1894, St. Kate's, which is no longer there, but on the hill down up the way. And so these industrial boarding schools, basically, to quote Captain Henry Pratt, the original founder of the first one of his statements was to kill the Indian and save the man. So directly about assimilation practices and things of that nature, right? And so the United States immediately recognized it was important to build these places within this area, right? And then, of course, the other ones in Arizona as well, a whole slew of Indian schools over there, all over the place, right? Now, they have fallen out of favor by the late 1920s. 1928 is a Marion Report, which listed a bunch of issues with these schools. And there was a shift away from these schools to day schools within the village, right? So go ahead and change the slide. The prioritization of the day schools so that students wouldn't be taken away from homes but would stay in their homes and be able to go to school within communities gave rise to, if Pueblos didn't already have these day schools, they're constructed, and then a less of a focus on assimilation practices and things of that nature. By the 1970s, there's a time period of federal Indian law called the Indian Self-Determination period, and there was an act in 1975 which allowed tribes to grant or contract, take over different programs and run it for themselves, and the federal government would give them the money that they would have otherwise used to run that program, right? So it sounded like, okay, well, that sounds good, like give you the money and then you do it yourself, right? It'll be better that way, right? So that also applies to the bureau-operated schools, right? And so today, there are about over 180 bureau-funded schools, so it's now the Bureau of Indian Education, BIE, and most of them are tribally controlled. So those tribes contract and grant those schools, and the federal government gives us the money to operate those schools with our own governing board and things like that. So it's okay, that's good. This is where I work right here, Kapo Community School. It's a grant school contracted in 2015, and we initiated in 2016 as a tribally controlled school. Dual language, so focus on our language, Tewa and English, right? Now, I want to go back, though, to the slide. So could you go back a couple slides? Is he up there? Could you go back a couple slides? One more. This one. Okay. So a number of years ago, my great aunt, she had inherited a shoebox of important papers, right? And these papers go all the way back into the 1800s, and they also are like receipts for the general store in Espanola that hasn't existed in a long time, like letters from relatives who were in World War II, a bunch of stuff, right? My great-great-great-grandmother had this box and passed it down, right? Now, at that time, my great-great-great-grandpa was governor of Santa Clara, so she also had all of his papers. So there wasn't like an archive or anything when you're a governor and you got like correspondence with the superintendent of Indian Affairs or whatever, then I guess you put it in a shoebox at that time. And then it passed down, so now I have those papers. And one of them that they chose to save for over 130 years now, right, is this certificate. And I've zoomed in on it because the language is very important on there. It says, This is for him, and he was governor when this was issued to him, because this was a permission slip so that the governor of Santa Clara Pueblo could visit the students at the Santa Clara Pueblo Day School. So the day school located in our village, he needed, and he's the governor, so he's the head of our community, had needed a permission slip to go visit our students at our village, at our school, right? It says, reposing trust in the integrity, sobriety, intelligence, and discretion of Felix Velarde, and in recognition of his progress in the ways of civilized life, I do hereby appoint him a visitor, right? And this was one of the things I went in the shoebox, because they're like, yeah, in case I ever need to see the kids at the school, I better have this so I could get on there, right? And so, one of the things I want to reflect back on, because I was like, wow, things were crazy back in the day, right? That's wild, right? And also because when I became the executive director of the school, we now have every single one of our leadership team at the school is from Santa Clara Pueblo. So all of us are from there for the first time that all the leadership of the school is from there. And so look how far we've come, where our own governor had to get this permission slip, right, to get on campus. And I was like, yeah, it's pretty amazing. And then becoming the leader of the school, I realized there's significant issues that are still ongoing, because the federal government says, okay, yeah, we'll contract the school. We'll give you all the money that we would have done to run the school, but there's a bunch of strings attached, right? So, and I was like, so coming into my position, learning all the strings, all kinds of strings all over the place, right? And they're like, wow, so like you say, here's the money, you can do what you want, but you really can't do what you want. You're like, here's all this money to buy blue strawberries. Like, but I don't need blue strawberries. Or like, tough luck. That's what that money's for, right? And so that's kind of how that works, right? One of the things after I became the executive director is I also became HR. And so one of my rough, rude awakenings was one day they showed up and were like, we're doing a audit of your personnel files. And I was like, okay, go ahead. They're over there. Go look around, whatever you want to do, right? They look around for a while, send me a report like 3 months later, and are like, here's all these findings of things that we need you to do, and you're out of compliance with hiring safe people at your school, right? And I was like, man, I didn't know I was putting all the kids in such danger. Let me check what they're saying, right? And there were interesting things. For example, one of the things they say, you know what? You haven't demonstrated that your staff are attended accredited institutions. So we need you to call UNM and make UNM prove to you that this person, or prove to you that they're a real school so you can hire this person, right? And you haven't demonstrated anywhere in your documents that UNM has proven to you that they're a real school. And I'm like, because everybody knows UNM is a real school. And they're like, well, that's a finding, and you're putting kids at risk right now. So you better call every university in your personnel files and make them prove to you that they're accredited, right? And I was like, okay, because I have a lot of free time on my hands as head of a school. And this is a very useful use of my time in life, right? So I spent a while doing that. And then they're like, you know what, you can't hire anybody unless they're adjudicated through a third party or all this process, right? And so you put in adjudicate all the documents, fingerprints, FBI, whole 5 years, everywhere anybody's ever been, anybody they've ever talked to, on and so forth. And then you wait for years till they approve it, right? I was like, what if you ever went to a job and they're like, you're hired and you can start in a year or two, right? Hang tight. You'll get to get a paycheck someday, right? That's how an operation was, right? I was like, that's not how anybody in the real world hires anybody. And also, this is our school. These are our kids. We're busy. We're in the business of caring for and raising up the next generation of our uncles, aunts, grandmas, grandpas, our tribal leaders, right? We're dedicated to trying to continue our language within our school, right? So that all of those traditions and customs that were passed down to us from time immemorial, from the beginning, wouldn't be lost on our watch, right? This is our work, is to raise up the next citizens of Kapolwinge, our village, right? And so it's very important to us to make sure that we're doing that in the best way we possibly can, because it's personal. It's not just a job, right? And these are all these kids, all our coworkers, these are people we'll see the rest of our lives, right? So these are not, it's not just something like, oh, it's just my day job and go on with my life. This is something that is part of everything I've talked about so far. All of the struggles, all of the things that our forebears overcame so that we could be sitting in that room now. And now that responsibility comes on our time to make sure that we carry on who we are as a Pueblo, right? And so when I go back to this document right here, I say, you know what? A lot has changed, but a whole lot hasn't. They're saying, you know what? We don't trust you to hire your own educators of your own kids because we don't think you would want the best for your own kids, right? So call UNM and make them prove they're a real school, right? This is a hurdle we're going to put up to make sure you're significantly progressed in the ways of civilized life. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it is the same, right? And so, you know, in my in my position, part of my job is to battle against these impositions of colonialism that are still alive and well and thriving. You know, they say, oh yeah, a lot's changed, but you think about it, it's like diet colonialism, right? Less sugar, say it's still Coke. A little cancer thrown in. So, you know, this is, when we think about all Pueblo revolts, there's a 1680 revolt, but there is a continuing legacy, the continuing striving to make sure that we continue as nations. And we don't know what the next things are going to be coming our way. We want to make sure the next generations are prepared so that they can make sure that we continue as a people. So with that, thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you and be on my soapbox. I think maybe a little time for questions.
Thank you, Porter. We're going to go ahead and have a Q&A right now. Prior to me coming here to the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, I was the interim principal at our day school at Tsuki Pueblo, the Tetsuge Wenge School. So I definitely can sympathize and understand what you are dealing with. And it's interesting because as a tribally controlled school, it's supposed to be run by the tribe, but then you have the BIE telling you what to do. So it's exactly that. So thank you, Porter, for all you do for your community. Is there any questions? We're going to pass this around.
Hi. About 12 years ago, I guess, you gave a tour, or 15, to members of the SAR board. And I was so fascinated when you said that your language, your native language, was never meant to be written. So tell me how you have progressed so far with your academic English written schooling. So how do you manage that when you're in that dual environment?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge at the school that, you know, we'll do a professional developments with, say, immersion schools in Hawaii or other places, right, that they're allowed to write their language and they have written form and it's standardized and things like that. So some of the things they do, you're like, oh yeah, we could do that too. But a bunch of other things, right, you're like, yeah, we can't do that, right? Because it's still the wish of our traditional leaders and leadership that it stays as an oral language, right? So it provides a special kind of challenge in a dual language school environment, but our approach really is to try to integrate language throughout the day that the students are hearing it, whether they're in lunch, whether they're walking in, whether in the classroom learning about astronomy or anything like that, that we have Tewa teachers in the classroom with the regular classroom teacher and other aides, right, that are using the language throughout the day, right, so that they're getting as much as possible day in and day out. So not written, but as an oral language, right?
So your storytelling is very much based in your native language.
Yeah, that's oral history. That's oral history, yeah. So I think there was one back there, and then we'll come back.
Hi, Porter. Thank you for a wonderful talk with us today. Learned so much. To the language question, can you record it, and can the students take or stream audio recordings of the language?
Yes, and each village has their own rules, right? But at Santa Clara, we have a language policy, right, that guides our what we can and can't do, right? And any kind of any it, people do write stuff down, even though they're not supposed to, right? And people make recordings and things like that, but it's not supposed to ever go outside of the school. So anytime that we work with any organization, we always enter an MOU, which explicitly says anything that's content related to language cannot exit our possession, is belongs to us, right? And you can't use it for anything else, right? So. Go.
Firstly, the issue of accreditation is one that's a pain for everybody, not just your tribes, okay? Secondly, getting around paperwork is an infinitely difficult task because there's always somebody making more paperwork. On the other hand, since we have to deal with it, there are lists of accredited schools from the 2 or 3 accreditation groups for the United States, and if you get them on an official letterhead to give you a list of the accredited schools, you can then copy that into the form and you're through with the nonsense. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. But and she had her hand back first back there, so.
And talk loudly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So much has been written about the work and the effort to review the experience of the Indian boarding schools by the Secretary of Interior, Jeff Holland. So I'm curious what you can tell us about her thoughts or about the Bureau's thoughts, Indian affairs, with respect to, yes, they've looked at the past, but what do they envision for the future?
I think you'd have to refer to their words on that, right? You know, as a school leader, you know, I don't, they, you know, a lot of times this is a thing. There's the intentions and words that people speak, right? And then the ways that policy actually unfolds, right? And it may or may not be directly linked with the words or the intention of the people who say it, right? So I think everybody can understand the staying power of bureaucracies, right? Very tenacious creatures, right? Very strong staying power, right? So even when new people come in and say, hey, we want to do things differently, or we don't see that this is the way things should be, it can take a long time for things to unfold. And a good example is the boarding schools started in the late 1870s, right? And it took till 1928 for the bureaucracy to reflect on itself and be like, hey, we're not really doing a great job. And that was like how many decades, right, later, right? So you can see one person in a 4-year time span can only do so much, right? But there's a lot of systems that are in place that kind of give issues, right? A good example of that is the Department of Education, right? So the Department of Education provides certain kinds of mandates that even if the Bureau of Indian Education is trying to shelter us from those mandates, they can't quite always do that, right? And so some of those issues, and the Department of Education is wildly non-reflective of tribal educational sovereignty and things of that nature, and probably don't even know what's going on that realm, right? So people on one side could be saying one thing, right, but they're impacted by a whole slew of other things, plus institutional knowledge that's decades old of the way things go, right? So I would say that the words that are spoken have good intent, but a lot of times it takes a long time, may not see the results of that till even after they're no longer there, right? So, but you can see some evidence of that, right? So I got an email a little while ago and they're like, hey, guess what? You don't have to make universities prove to you that they're real schools. And I was like, I didn't think I had to do that, but so there's a good example, right? I think someone over here first.
Yeah. It was just more a comment. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm from Puerto Rico, and if you know a little bit about our history, I thank you for starting your topic saying this is not only the history here in New Mexico, this is the history of the whole, like, Hispanic America. And I have lived in many places and traveled and visited many countries and other states. And really, I feel at home here because I feel it's my story. So I really appreciate learning about the history of New Mexico because there's a lot of history of Puerto Rico that has been lost. So I just feel like I'm learning about myself. And so you're talking about my people. And also, I appreciate how you're talking about how colony is still alive in these examples because the bureaucracy that you're experiencing in school is the one that we leave for everything, like, every day, for every detail. So I like that you take your, like, the reach that you have in your position to still enlighten people about what's going on today because colonialism is still alive, and we're a colony. Even if they want to use a different term, revolt resistance, we're still resisting with our language and our customs, but that, unfortunately, we lost our original language too. So it's a comment just saying thank you for that. And if you haven't visited Puerto Rico, I think you should. I tell everyone that, but I think you should. And then just last comment, I don't know if you watch SNL, but if you just look up, there's a clip of Bad Bunny and Marcelo Hernandez, which is a comedian from Miami. They have a clip where the Spanish people are going back to Spain to give their updates, like they messed up, they got to the wrong place. But this is what we found. And the whole, like, just go around it. You have to look up the clip.
Thank you
It's
for that.
Marcelo Hernandez and Bad Bunny and SNL. Look.
Thank you. I'll look it up.
Hi, thank you for your informative talk. Yeah, I had a question too about colonialism, and I was wondering, so the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center has a display that talks about the 3 phases of colonization of New Mexico, and they talk about the Spanish period and the Mexican period, and then the American period, of course, too. And so we see nowadays there's the question of what is colonialism and who is the colonist and stuff like that now. I was wondering, do you agree with that display that there are 3 periods of colonialism in New Mexico? I know you mentioned about Santa Ana in there and the Chimayo Rebellion, but you didn't talk very much about the Mexican period, even though it was short. But they talk about the governmental wars against the nomadic tribes and efforts to, take land from the Indians during all 3 periods. So I was wondering if you agree with that.
Here's what I would say is colonialism is like Baskin Robbins. There's 31 flavors. It's all ice cream. It's all colonialism, but they operate in very different ways, right? And so there's definitely, even though the Mexican period, the Chimayo Rebellion occurred during that time period, right? Definitely certain things that the way that the government acted, the Mexican government, or more importantly, didn't act, right? Because New Mexico, a lot of times, is just a forgotten outpost during even the 1700s and going into the Mexican period. And so a lot of times just forgotten. So that creates certain processes that change things. So a good example of that is the Office of the Protector of the Indios was connected with the Spanish government. When that office went away, there was definitely people and the authorities that took advantage of that opportunity and the change in status, right? But also, I think it's really important to note, like from the 1837, 1847, that communities in New Mexico at that time were very, very tight with each other. And so it's almost like people were very, very close together at that time. And the Americans, in a lot of ways, drove that relationship apart, right? And so that ways people can't think of, like, oh, how was it that all those people, all these vecinos elected a Pueblo guy as governor, right? Well, it's because of how the relationship was at that time, right? And also the response to the sense of how people perceived the Mexican government at that time. But also people were, there's some well-known descriptions of Independence Day celebrations here in Santa Fe for Mexican Independence Day, and people were, definitely motivated to celebrate the new country, right? So when you think about waves of colonialism, might not have been as overt right? But definitely the 1837 Chimayo Rebellion tells part of that story, right? So I don't know who all had their hands.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Just want to thank you, first of all, for your talk, and I wanted to add a little bit of context to the lady from Puerto Rico who spoke a few moments ago. There's a great deal more in common between Puerto Rico and the Pueblos here in this region. And that is that in 1899, just after the Spanish-American War, over 60 students were recruited to attend the Carlisle Indian School from Puerto Rico. And it was pretty much under the same circumstances. They explained to them that they were going to be Americanized, and they, of course, agreed to do that. So it's just a point for you, and also just to share with the group.
Thank you. There's a gentleman back there.
Thank you, Dr. Swentzell, for your lecture. That was very informative. I'm from the Hopi tribe, and after Awatave, it seems like we're fortunate that we're so far west that we were left alone after that. Remain more or less culturally pure, if you would, relatively to this day. But now living here in Santa Fe for the last 40 years, 50, we're somewhere in there. It seems like this town is having problems writing the history. Who writes the history? Specifically downtown, in our plaza area. I know that my wife's great-great-grandfather was marching around there, paraded a ram, Pope, and I'm sure there are others, but I was wondering if there was anything that you know of the written history of those kind of struggles or those kinds of aggressions taken on people there in our plaza area of Santa Fe that one could read and understand about, who's been prosecuted through there or in that area. It just seems like there's been, just shy of down the hill from here, a lot of conflict that's occurred. But be interesting reading. I don't know if there's anything that somebody tried to account for.
Yeah, I'm not personally aware of any kind of list of all the things that happened. I mean, I'm like, yeah, somebody could probably sit there and go through, because that was the capital for hundreds of years of the colonial government, and then even with the Americans and Mexicans, right? So, people get executed there, flogged, and besides all the other things that are mentioned in here, it's probably a huge list. So it doesn't really surprise me why ghost tours are so popular there. But I don't know if someone's gone through and compiled the list of how much has happened. Even the barracks was like where the New Mexico History Museum is now on the backside of the palace. That area was like a barracks area for the Presidial soldiers, right? So it was like kind of like a fort almost, that they could close off the area and defend it, but it was also, where you took people before you punished them for whatever it was, That's, I don't know any unless anybody here is familiar. Somebody compiled that. Yeah, did you?
I'd just like to point out that what you're talking about is cultures clashing for mostly the Anglo, the Hispanic, and the Indian cultures have been sort of competing for basically cultural dominance. And now there's this new robotic culture coming on us that seems to be kind of like global and unstoppable. And it seems like, well, they're all going to bleed together undoubtedly, and yet at the same time it seems super important that we sort of honor our traditions, our past. And I think one wise man in history said, push the envelope but honor the past. And we're always going to be stuck with that dilemma.
I have three quick questions. One, what percentage of the Santa Clara Pueblo of the whole group live on the Pueblo? Two, how many children are in the school? And three, do you think having a strong Pueblo school supports or motivates more individuals to return and live on the Pueblo?
So I don't have the actual hard numbers on that, but it's probably about 50% of the people live there in the Pueblo itself, right? The school right now has a little over 90 students, so we're a very small school. And so no, we're not as small as some of the other bureau schools as well, but we're fairly small. One of the dynamics is that the school had maybe about 120 to 130 students some years ago, right? And the pandemic hit, and a lot of the tribes in New Mexico were pretty hard hit, but also very proactive in instituting serious protective measures to protect lives. And so at Santa Clara, like many other pueblos, shut down the roads, put up checkpoints, shut everything down, including the school. So starting at the beginning of the pandemic all the way till last year, we were in virtual learning mode, right? So after all the other schools have mostly started to open up, we were among some of the last ones, and I know some of the other Pueblo ones were the same boat as well, that all the other schools were opening, but we were still closed. So, but then parents had to go to work and stuff like that, right? They couldn't stay back while their kid is in virtual learning. So you had a situation where they started to pull students out to attend other schools simply because they couldn't do virtual learning anymore. So I came on July 2022, so I'm a year and a half in. When I came, the enrollment had dropped down to 70. So we almost lost close to 40% of our enrollment. We reopened and, held on to that. We had experienced a 22% increase in enrollment for this year. So really focusing on that community outreach engagement, so we can say, hey, we're doing a bunch of cool stuff. We're open again. We're doing the things that you would expect from a community school, and we're trying our best to do some of these community events that people really appreciated, and people see the value in that, and bring students back. But that's part of the challenge there. I don't have a good answer for how, if people, part of any kind of school is almost like you have branding and you have to market, right? And I like to say, hey, we're like one of the only Tewa dual language schools. We're the only one with Santa Clara dialect in the world. So we have no competitors out there. But in reality, we have a lot of other schools that people may choose to take their students, right? But to differentiate that, hey, we're really the only ones doing this particular thing. So it's your choice, but if you want your students to experience this kind of education, that's why we're here, right? And then people can make that choice.
Thanks, Mom. One of your last slides was, but we didn't stop on it. It said, what is the next revolt? And I was curious, do you think that right now that may be what is known as it's become more popular in recent years, maybe that is the land back movement. And so how do you relate to this current movement that is becoming more and more popularized, not just in the US, but across the world? And maybe even how do you define land back?
That's a good, I think that's definitely one of the things that, land, water, language, culture, right? Governance, health. Those are all the key. In 2012 and then again in 2018, there was a Pueblo convocation by the Santa Fe Leadership Institute, bringing all different Pueblo people, artists, leaders, elders, from all different walks of life together. Those are the issues that came up, right? I think land back is probably different for other tribal nations, and especially because I used to teach at I had there's students from 100-ish different tribal nations there. So at any given time, I had students from all over the place, right? All different kinds of cultures, languages, everything, worldviews, and so I would be like, what am I doing? Like, how could I be the teacher of all these people? They have their own knowledge, everything. I can't tell them how it is because I don't know what it's like if your people were entirely removed from your traditional land base, right? Completely, and moved to an entirely different place, right? And how do you continue on? Like, I realized, like, that's a privilege that I could walk into our our plaza and be like, wow, we've been here for like 700 years, probably minimum, right? And then before that, we're up there, and it's on our land. We own that ancestral village on our land base, right? So to me, then it goes to much more local rather than I don't like to make definitions for everybody, right? Because I can't even speak to that experience of what it might have been like to be from what is today Georgia and now living in Oklahoma, right? What does that? That's a level of violence that's hard for me to fully fathom that level, right? Not to say, again, there's many flavors of colonialism like Baskin Robbins. Some of those are really different from each other. So, Protestant American colonialism looked very different than Catholic Spanish colonialism, unfolded in very different ways, right? The part of the ways that unfolded is why we're on our traditional homeland. They say, I guess Rocky Road tastes like that, right? Or whatever. But that, like for Santa Clara Pueblo, they brought the train in the 1880s, the Chile Line, 1888. Train cut through right by our plaza, right? They put a depot a mile or so from the village proper. And people just started to move in there, and they built a town. That town's called Espanola, right? And so that entire town, for the most part, is within the boundary of Santa Clara Pueblo. So imagine like some people built a town in your backyard, right? And then fast forward decades, right? And you're like, land back looks like getting all that was ours to begin with back to us, right? But someone built a town there. And so it's not like that simple, right? And so it's a big part of economic development efforts really is geared towards, I hate to say it, should be ours already, but we have to buy that back, right, at market price, basically, right? And in addition to that, right, is that in the 1700s there was a family, a Spanish settler family that moved into our watershed, and they started to divert our stream that we use for the Pueblo. And again, we went to a protector of the Indios and had them thrown out of there. And they said, yeah, your traditional homeland includes the entire Cañada de Santa Clara. The whole watershed of the Santa Clara Creek belongs to you. So we had that letter, and we're like, yep, that's how it's been. That's how it's supposed to be, right? Fast forward to the American time, the Americans couldn't translate Cañada. So they said that the land was just the creek itself, not the watershed, right? So it was like the square of the Spanish grant and then a little like balloon string coming off of it, right? That was the stream. And so that was rectified in the Pueblo Lands Act to just kind of be expanded out, right? But it's not the whole watershed still yet, right? A lot of that is federal land. That could be a good example of land back. Like, that should be under our administration, right? So I'm just talking from my own perspective, right? Every village has its own story. Another good example is it couldn't translate Sierra in English, and so they cut off Sandia Pueblo's land base, right? They're the what are they called? The people that measure land? Surveyor. I'm all brain dead now. Surveyors didn't want to walk. Their land's supposed to go to the top, and then they just cut it off on the bottom instead of putting it where it's supposed to be. You know, that's really very, very a big disservice. So those are in our context here, a lot of that's like, hey, those wrongs that were done, they should be rectified for sure.